Hello, and welcome to my talk on 7 stages to decolonize advertising and the creative industries. And this is the agenda for our reunion today. So I'm going to talk first about my background research, then I'm going to look at a case study of an advertising campaign, then looking at my methods and methodologies, then I'll end with the 7 stages, and then there'll be time for questions based on what you've heard today. So the intro. Please keep in mind that my research focuses specifically on Mexico, as I've been working in the advertising industry there for over 25 years. And this research has been like 8 years. And I'm looking at creating more diversity in Mexican advertising. However, the learnings can be applied to other areas within the creative industries. The concept of colonialism still exists in the Western world, with obvious examples remaining in their former colonies, in this case, Mexico, where outdoor advertising is widely used in Mexico City to reach the various target markets located within the 25 million inhabitants of one of the world's largest cities. So take a look at this ad. Does it look racist to you? Think about what is not there. Look at these ads. In a country like Mexico, where 90% of the citizens are people of color, I ask, why are they not appearing in these ads or these ads? And these billboards I took in January when I was driving around Mexico City on the Periférico. And what's important, I think, that you need to realize is what is not shown is important. My research has revealed that many advertising messages contain 2 meanings. One that the brand wants you to see, and the secondary messages that reinforce colonial concepts such as race and class. Therefore, I propose that communications, and often advertising, is a tool used by the people in power in order to control. For over 100 years, Western ad agencies have been going into developing countries and promoting their clients' brands through cultural signs that are then reinterpreted in order to gain recognition with both the consumers and the powers that be. I now want to define some terms that I'm going to be using quite a bit during this presentation. So I define advertising as a designed communication that reinterprets signs and symbols in order to persuade. Because that's what we do. I am an art director background, and I will take elements of popular culture and reassemble them and then create my message. What is to colonize? Well, to colonize means to send people to live in and govern another country. For example, Singapore was colonized by the British, and they imposed anti-homosexual laws, and homosexuality was not legalized until 2022. Then decolonizing. So I define decolonizing as involving removing or rewriting rules and concepts left by colonial era thinking that still control or influence society. And in Mexico, the Spanish who came left a lot of rules that were left there when they gave independence to Mexico. So why this research? Well, in 1994, when I moved to Mexico, I couldn't understand why the people on the streets were not appearing in the advertising. And my clients would select models that had light skin and European facial characteristics. And I was used to seeing advertising reflecting the people in the streets, like I experienced in Canada and the UK. However, in Mexico, my clients, who often were people of color, were selecting the European-looking models. I asked why, and then they said, well, it's aspirational advertising strategy and works very well for the Mexican consumer. The strategy of aspirational was widely used to sell products from gum to cars to luxury clothing in Latin America, specifically in countries like Peru, Central America, and Mexico. So take a look at this slide and tell me what you think all these people have in common, or say to yourself in your head. Guessing? they're all Mexicans. But, you know, we have these stereotypes of what a Mexican is. But in this slide, we have in the top left corner over here, we have Mennonites, which came to Mexico many years ago. We have Afro-Mexicans, we have Chinese Mexicans. Of course, we have the indigenous peoples. So Mexico is very diverse and has many different types of people and immigrants, and that is growing the diversity. So there are issues in advertising that are being written up in the mass media. There was an article in the Los Angeles Times about colorism and white privilege in Mexican advertising. There's been different articles within the general press and the trade press in Latin America. There also was a report about how the advertising industry is becoming less diverse. So what I want to do now is just look at some advertising campaigns in Mexico. This is one for a beer called Indio, which is basically the word Indian. And what the campaign was they got influencers from social media and they wore t-shirts, white t-shirts that said Pinche Indio. And the word pinche was crossed out. And pinche is sort of a disrespectful word, discriminatory word, like that type of move, like pinche Indio, right? And the thing that made this campaign very controversial in Mexico was the fact that the influencers were all people with lighter skin, and there was no indigenous peoples or Indios that were actually wearing the t-shirt. So that caused a lot of backlash on social media, and the campaign was taken down. Then there's this campaign from Sears, which is a Mexican department store chain owned by one of the world's richest men, who is also Mexican, Mr. Carlos Slim. And it shows an indigenous woman selling bracelets next to a tall white woman. Another shows a white man looking down at another indigenous person, and the headline reads, "Vacations." It shows an indigenous woman selling bracelets next to a tall white woman. Another shows a white man looking down at another indigenous person. The white superiority is implied in these adverts, and the differences between primitive clothing and the contemporary fashions are highlighted. These adverts also objectify indigenous peoples as something to be looked at on holiday, someone to take a selfie with, like an animal at the zoo. In reactions to the ads, Mexican social media blew up. However, Sears didn't remove the ads. Instead, they responded to the complaints by tweeting that it celebrates Mexican culture. So I ask, what specific stage of the marketing process does racism and classism appear in the advertising process? Or are the people that create these ads racist? And they're not, but it's something I had to ask myself. So here's another ad. This is a TV commercial that ran.
No, está apartado por un amigo.
Llegó toda la adrenalina de los nuevos Monster Runners. Nos gusta la adrenalina. Saborea el turbo queso.
So potato crisp called Runners. And so I analyzed this commercial, and it sort of demonstrates confrontation between the higher middle classes versus the lower economic classes. And this is reinforced through the use of signs, which is something that in semiotics we look at in order to make an interpretation. And the signs emphasize the differences and the socioeconomic status between the kids and the crowd eating the product, and then the guy that came out of the car. And also, what it also looks at, the signs of economic status, age difference, and music. And Runners creates a mythical story of a struggle between the contemporary middle class and the traditional lower class in Mexico. So why is Mexican advertising lacking diversity? Well, visual representation and how people are shown, and that can reinforce this idea of otherness. 500 years ago, the ruling class in Mexico categorized its inhabitants into racial categories, with indigenous being the lowest and Spanish-born the highest. After Spanish colonization, the races began to mix, creating a new Mexican-born group named mestizos. And during the early 17th century, after the Spanish had the local population under their control, they began to classify their citizens into castas or categories, which is a hierarchical system of racial differentiation or classification. It placed the Spanish-born at the top and gave them the most rights, and the indigenous at the bottom. Castas were the product of mixing of Spanish with Creoles, indigenous mestizos, and blacks. In the 18th century, this classification was represented through paintings, las pinturas de castas, or paintings of castes. Each painting depicted a couple and their offspring, demonstrating skin color, clothing, and customs. These paintings also represented the pyramid structure based on race, where the Spanish-born had all the political power. These constructed images favored the native-born Spanish, as demonstrated in the slide of the light-skinned people, where the figures are presented in the dignified manner, versus the image of the mixed-race couple depicting an indigenous male fighting a mulatta who has a child on her back. So in semiotics, we look at signs, right? So if you look at the signs that are in this picture, we have the gentleman standing there fixing the hair. We have very expensive, ornately carved furniture and mirrors. We have the child there doing, I'm not sure. And then we have the ornate clothing. Versus this other image where we have the couple fighting. She's not doing his hair. She's grabbing it. She has an implement at the back. They do not have walls in their house. So it's creating this idea of the other, us versus them. And there were 15 of these paintings done. And these are in the Castillo de Chapultepec in Mexico City, but there's other examples of these pictures that were across Latin America, and in Peru, they have them as well. Hernan Cortés caused the downfall of the Aztec Empire in the early 16th century, had a slave named Malinche, who also spoke Mayan and the language of the Aztecs, Nahuatl. She translated for him, and they became lovers. Malinche is known as the mother of modern Mexico because of her and Cortés's reunion, which signified the mixing of the European and indigenous bloods. This union created the racial and cultural category of mestizo, which represents 83% of the Mexican population. So the Mexican state embraced the ideology of mestizaje as a national building tool, with the objective of integrating indigenous peoples into the national identity. The ideology, called by Vasconcelos as La Raza Cósmica, which was very influential, that the government removed racial categories from the Mexican census and replaced with language as the method to identify indigenous peoples. Salvidar notes that after the Mexican Revolution in 1910 to 1920, José Vasconcelos put the blame on racial and economic differences and imagined the creation of the blending of the races as a solution. However, in contemporary Mexico, Vasconcelos' ideology has helped in removing the hidden racial and ethnic prejudice and discrimination that the original peoples and other peoples of color, such as Asian, Mexicans, and Afro-Mexicans, from the conversations. Basically, La Raza Cósmica theory has been used to deny that racism and discrimination exist in Mexico. Its limitations in addressing racial bias and recognition of diversity, such as the indigenous peoples, need exploring, as indigenous peoples and their culture are being forgotten, not just in Mexico, but in the rest of Latin America. Racism is a term that can be best described as a construct focused or based on physical and cultural characteristics. According to Monica Figueroa, an Afro-Mexicana who teaches at the University of Cambridge, she says that in Mexico, race and class influence each other, where citizens can be treated one way due to their class and then another due to their race. In addition to racism, the term colorism can be applied to discrimination based on skin color, and is similar to racism because color and colorism have not or have been closely related to race and racism. And in Latin America, the two sets of concepts have particularly overlapped. This is due to racial mixing and intermarriage. Racial differentiation is increasingly difficult with lighter-skinned mestizos on the top and darker mestizos at the bottom. In Latin America and Mexico, race and colorism can be thought of as the same concept and interchangeable terms to racism. Next, I would like to explore one of Mexican ruling families and an advertising campaign produced for one of his businesses. One important family I focused on benefited from the Mexican Revolution and took advantage of their position to control through communication, and more specifically through creation of advertising messages. Familia Alberto Valladares Gonzalez is Mexico's third richest family with over $8.5 billion in wealth. And it owns one of the world's largest silver mines and the luxury department store chain Palacio de Hierro. In 1967, Alberto's father passed away, and he inherited stocks in 11 companies and ownership of 15 businesses, including the upscale department store Palacio de Hierro. And within 40 years, he was the unconditional friend of 5 Mexican presidents. Alberto has been described as a man with many passions, including architecture, design, and advertising, and he was personally involved in the store's advertising campaigns and selected the aspirational concept for Palacio de Hierro, and their campaign is, "I am totally Palacio." And the campaign has always consisted of beautiful blonde white women since its creation to the present day. I'm now going to present a small case study of Palacio de Hierro. The original campaign consisted of 5 billboards, various magazines and newspaper ads, along with television and radio ads. Advertising messages are designed to broadcast a specific message. However, many contain a second level of messaging, promoting racial inequality, ideology, or gender bias. The main message delivered by the brand to the audience when looking at the billboard campaign is the Totally Palacio collections are available at the diverse Palacio de Hierro. This message is supported through the central idea of the campaign that represents diversity by featuring a different stereotype in each ad. So in this one, we have unconventional beauty. This one is old age. This one is androgyny. And this one is overweight. As reported in the Mexican press at the launch of this campaign, Palacio de Hierro wants to break stereotypes and promote diversity. And this message is what the brand and the ad agency want to be interpreted by the viewers of the campaign. Unfortunately, the main issue of diversity is not reflected in the ads by the fact that all the models are white and do not feature anyone who represents 90% of the Mexican population. The ads only show white models representing 10% of the total population, and no racial diversity is presented. So the anti-stereotypes billboard campaign from Palacio de Hierro broadcasts 2 messages, a main message and a secondary message. The secondary level of messaging confronts the economically challenged viewer with the harsh realities of life in Mexico by presenting designer commodities that only the wealthy can afford. Even though the ads celebrate diversity, it is only white diversity and does not recognize the diversity of the other 90% of the population. The advertisements are also important through what they don't show, which are people of color, and this reinforces the concept of erasure, where what is not shown is forgotten. So just to go over this sort of beginning part, the racial and class history created by the ruling families is unconsciously maintained through messages that portray ideas that indirectly reinforce their power. And to the advertising reflects the idea that light-skinned people have that power. So I'm showing you the Pintores de Castas compared to the current advertising campaign of Palacio de Hierro. And this translates into advertising that mostly features light-skinned actors, creating the idea that lighter skin is better and therefore aspirational to consumers. And again, this is in Mexico, right? So I have all this information. What do I do with it? Well, what I decided to do was challenge the Mexican ad industry. And what I wanted to do was creative-based research that challenged the Mexican industry to be more diverse, both in front of the camera and behind the camera. And so the research question that I was working with asked, how can a poster campaign generate a conversation about colonial and racist thinking in order to create greater diversity in Mexican advertising? So that was the question I had in my head. And then the research objectives were, first of all, I wanted to evolve the advertising industry. I love advertising. I've worked in it for a big part of my life, and I think advertising is fantastic. And I think we also need to evolve and we need to grow. And then the second part was that I wanted to see if there was an issue of racism in Mexican advertising. Because one thing is my opinion, but what do Mexicans think? So I needed to find out what Mexicans thought. And then also I wanted to find out what solutions Mexicans would be offering. So they wouldn't be my solutions, it would come from people in Mexico. So I deconstructed the advertising process. But when I was doing the research, I also had to keep in mind that I'm a white male and I'm situated in a Western institution, which in this case was the University of Westminster and the Royal College of Art. And I worked in the practice of advertising for 25 years, and I am in a position of privilege. So what I don't want to do is be a white savior. I do not want to create messaging on behalf of Indigenous peoples. And what I did is use my position of privilege and the fact that I knew many people in advertising in Mexico to help generate and create this conversation. So I did 5 phases for this part of the research. And I'm going to go through those phases now. So phase 1 was looking at the actual the advertising process from when we do research to get briefed from the client, we do strategies, brainstorming, presentations, testing, generating the idea, producing it, and then post-testing. But what I did is because that's huge to analyze, so I just focused on this area, which was looking at when the ad is produced and is broadcast. And I looked at 3 different socioeconomic areas. I looked at 4 blocks in a wealthy area, 4 blocks in a middle class area, and 4 blocks in a lower socioeconomic area, and analyzed all the 2D messaging. And I looked at the tools and techniques used to create the advertising messages to see where racism could come in. My research revealed that the technique of paper and hand-drawn text through black ink was used in each of the 3 socioeconomic areas. What I'm showing you here is the lower socioeconomic area and examples of 2D advertising. However, it was more prevalent in the lower socioeconomic areas, the idea of neon with black text, right? Leading to the conclusion that one of the preferred tools and techniques used by the layperson is to use the tool of a pen on neon paper to generate a message. Then for phase 2, what I ended up doing there was I went and worked with the local peoples to look at how they wanted to be represented in advertising, and I used decolonial research methods. It was also important for me to use decolonized research methods when working with vulnerable populations, because I was looking to remove the power imbalances that can occur when agency people go and interview their target markets. And one of those decolonized methods that I used was called co-production. And did workshops showing them the people in the village, it was the city of Iguala, and looking at current advertising campaigns, asking them what they thought about them and if it included them, or why they liked them, why they didn't like them. And then also, they also created advertising that showed how they want to be reflected in ads. And then for phase 3, I took the learnings from phase 1 and phase 2 and created a poster campaign called Racismo Neon. And it is made up using the tools and techniques that we use in branding. And I needed to create a message that would be read by advertising people, but not rejected by them because of the design. I needed the audience to read the message before they had time to reject the message content. Art direction can alert people to the content, and I wanted these messages to be simple, activist messages, looking like they were hand-drawn on neon paper, like the ones that people do who do not have any training in advertising. I wanted the messages to look unsuspecting, so I deliberately didn't make them look sophisticated using the latest typographic fonts or using complicated logos or expensive photography or illustration techniques. I wanted the message to be simple, reduced to its simplest form. an unassuming message that would be read by the unsuspected advertising community. Then through the headline, the message would then reach them. So this is the campaign, and these are the 7 different types of posters. They were done in Spanish, but I put the English translation here because people have often thought when I show this, why did you do it in English, Carl? But it's not. It was done in Spanish. That's just for translation purposes. And it says, if advertising reflects society, then advertising is racist. Or advertising only reflects indigenous culture in charity ads. And all the ads end with the hashtag Racismo Neon. Because remember, I wanted to create a conversation. Another ad said, consumers dream of being white even though they are brown. Whites are 10% of the population, but are in 70% of the ads. I want clear eyes, so I will buy these crisps. If Morenos are 80% of the population, why are we not in 80% of the ads? And why do ads favor white models and the American lifestyle? And then 4,000 of these posters were put up in areas where advertising agencies are located in Mexico City and around where clients are of those agencies as well. And it was put up over 2 weeks. And that was analog content. I also created 3 social media pages, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And the creating of the posters was put online, and then the posting of the posters was as well. And that created the digital conversation that I could then analyze. So the campaign was posters. Also PR was used. So a press release was done that was then sent out to the trade press so that people who didn't see the posters would get the message through stories reported in the press. So I was able to reach the target market both ways. And also having PR, also having it written up in the trade press helps justify the message and spread it out. So advertising people would see the poster and then read about it in the trade press the next day. Phase 4 was the analyzing of the conversation. So the press picked it up, they discussed it, and then people would discuss the campaign underneath. Because remember, I wanted to have Mexicans first to see whether they agreed that there was racism in Mexican advertising or not. And that was not my decision to make. It was the Mexicans' decision to make. And then would they come up with solutions? And if so, what were they? So then I analyzed through social listening the conversation that happened online. Yes. And then phase 5 was then working with the advertising community in Mexico on how to decolonize advertising. So the outcomes were a multimedia campaign, which was analog and spread through different media channels. And I'm just going to explain those now. So the press picked up the story and started talking about it. The indigenous population have a website, the Zapatistas, and they reproduced the story on their media channels. Then I was able to have a conference sponsored by Roast Brief, which is a big Latin American blog. And I was able to get leaders from Mexican advertising, the head of the Mexican creative community, owners of ad agencies, creatives, and also account people. And we had a discussion on 1, whether they thought there was racism in advertising, and number 2, what solutions would they offer to that? And that was all recorded. Then there was an academic conference that was sponsored by the Mexicans Creative Club. And I was able to get some other academics who do research on racism in advertising in Mexico. And then they talked about it. And the audience were the creative community in Mexico. Then workshops were held. So the conference earlier was with the sort of top people, the people that run the agencies. And the workshops, I was able to go to the actual workers, so the people who create the advertising messages, to see what they thought and the solutions that they offered. And they created a campaign, actually, called Piel Neon, which was about, they created an image bank for advertising that would have images of Mexicans during everyday activities that agencies could use in Mexico. Because often the problem with image banks is that most of the people in the images are very light-skinned or white families. And then the Mexican government has an exhibition called Racismo in Mexico, and they invited the Racismo Neon campaign to be part of that exhibition. And there was an NGO called Racismo MX, and they publicized the Racismo Neon poster campaign on their media channels. And Palacio de Hierro last year created a campaign, and for the first time in their advertising, they used an Afro-Mexican person in their ads along with the other types of people that they use. So I just want to show you a quick little video that just is a resume or summary of what I've just talked to you about.
The concept of colonialism still exists in the Western world. Take a look at this ad, or these. Do they look racist to you? In a country like Mexico, where 90% of consumers are people of color, what is not shown is important. Contemporary advertising still reinforces colonial ideas such as racism and classism. How do we get the ad community to recognize and discuss this difficult subject? What would they respond to? Introducing Racismo Neon, the world's first visual activist campaign that weaponizes advertising by targeting the message creators. First, we went to the very people that are forgotten. Based on this research, we chose the most basic form of advertising, the poster. 7 were created, placed in areas where many ad agencies and their clients are located. The campaign reached 90% of Mexico's ad industry. 14 million people saw the physical campaign. Millions of dollars in earned media, resulting in 2 large events with top industry leaders to discuss solutions.
Me comprometo a que este tema no sea solamente en este panel que acaba de pasar.
Yo les invito a toda la industria a crear estereotipos positivos.
Recognition that advertising is racist. Representation of all of Mexicans. Increase people of color working in advertising. Reduce the number of light-skinned models. Eliminate tokenism. Racismo Neon sets an example for the world's creative industries on how to evolve advertising by removing colonial thinking from visual communication.
So this is the last part of my presentation, and this project asks, how can a poster campaign generate a conversation about colonial and racist thinking in order to create greater diversity in Mexican advertising? And the findings reveal that advertising can disrupt colonial and racist thinking underlying Mexican advertising through collaboration with local peoples and creating a conversation in the media to remove concepts such as racism from branded messages. By asking Mexicans themselves if there was a problem in advertising, and Mexicans themselves coming up with the solutions. And I'm just going to tell you what those solutions are. And these solutions that I'm giving you are linked to the United Nations Sustainable Goals, which are now becoming quite important. And in Cannes, the Festival of Creativity, they're including that, now an award for that. So one would be avoiding aspirational strategies. Another would be removing stereotypes. Another would be teaching about racism in the media and universities. And this is beginning to happen. And they've invited me to go, and I've been speaking to Mexican universities. And also brands leading through positive examples. There are some great examples in Mexico of advertising that reflects the culture and that celebrates it. And so let's take those best practices and show them to other brands, because they often say that, you know, we do advertising like this because that's what the Mexicans want. Well, there are examples of brands that are breaking that mold and are doing well and having sales and are selling products. You can't use that excuse that that's what Mexicans want when we interview them. Other things that came up would be creating a Mexican industry-funded body similar to what we have in Britain, which is the ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority. And they act in between public disputes between agencies and the public when the public has issues with ads, for example. Also, there are current industry bodies in Mexico, but they're very siloed. So you'll just have an advertising body for medicine advertising or one just for food. So the idea would be those bodies creating rules that could be, that advertising could reflect the percentages of the way people are distributed in Mexico. And then also another solution would be to apply semiotic thinking to advertising. So you could analyze the ad before it gets broadcast to see if there are any issues that come up. And the semiotics can do that and pull out and discover those hidden secondary messaging that I've been talking about. Also hiring more people of color so that when you're making decisions, when you're creating the strategy, you have different types of people in the room that can recognize if there's issues or if certain people or certain things are forgotten about. And then the final would be having the branded gaze workshops, which are where you actually work with the people that are creating the ads and sensitizing them and getting them as part of the solution and participating. So the 7-stage strategy framework for the culture industry to remove colonial thinking is based on what I've just shown you. And the first stage would be asking why. So that would be an empirical study looking at the colonial history and understanding the ruling class or power dynamics that are happening. And this can be in any culture industry. Number 2 would then be asking how, and that will be decoding the tools and techniques of that particular product, whether that's music, whether that's film, whether it's television, whether it's a podcast, or whether that's an ad. And semiotically analyzing to see where does racism come in or colonial thinking come into the creation of those products. Number 3 would be discover. So that will be decolonial workshops, working with peoples and discussing stuff with them and using decolonial workshopping methods when you're working with them to see how they want to be reflected in the mediums or the products that you're creating. Number 4 will be sharing, which will be creating an encoded message directed at the specific culture industry community, and that will be to generate a conversation. And again, that could be a song, that could be a film, that could be a TV program, or in my case, it was an advertising campaign. And that would be to generate a conversation. Then you listen and you analyze that conversation to see what people think, what the actual people think, rather than it just being a group of a select group of people. You're actually going out to everybody and finding out what people think. Then unite, and that would be then, once you've got the results of that analysis, you will then go to the actual industry bodies and discuss it with them. And then finally, we'll be implementing whatever was decided. So those would be the 7 stages. This would be the framework I think would work very well for removing and decolonizing the culture industries. And so it can be applied to advertising to discover thinking and ideas in different racial groups or ethnic groups. And it could be applied to colonizer countries like Britain or Spain, or to the colonized, which would be countries like the Caribbean, certain places in Africa, Asia, and those countries. And also in the culture industries, this strategy, those 7 steps could be applied to different industries such as TV, film, gaming, music, to uncover colonial thinking and try and remove it from the actual end product. So there's the 7-stage strategic framework that I said that I would present today, and thank you very much. Thank you. So my understanding is that people can ask questions if you want. And if you want to ask a question, they come up here, right? They stand in front of the microphone. So if anybody wants to come up and ask a question, please go ahead. But be kind.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. This was really interesting, and I think, a successful campaign, and thanks for sharing that. I wonder if what steps you could take to sort of decolonize the relationship between brands and people that advertising seems to lock in place. Like, how can we take this one step further to decolonize that relationship?
Okay, so great question. I guess you could use these steps with a specific brand in mind and look at the different channels that that brand uses to communicate with its consumers. So and they would have to be on the country by country base because everybody's different, right, in different nations. But I think, yeah, you could apply this to a brand, but again, it would be looking at the communication channels that will be used to speak to that. Again, I'm just responding to this question. I think it's a great question. I would need to put more time into it, but that would be my first initial response. Thank you. Hi.
Kia ora koutou katoa from New Zealand. My name is Paul. I'm a very Caucasian practitioner in the advertising and design industry. This is really interesting. I just wanted to ask, because I come from a country that has a very horrendous colonial history and is confronting that day to day still. And I look at our industry with great encouragement because we are now at a point where Indigenous practitioners and practitioners from around the world are impossible to hire because they are so in demand. And our industry is now using tools, fonts, typography, design systems that are built from Indigenous cues. So it's not just the messaging and the representation that has changed, it's actually the tools by which we create these assets and these things. Anyway.
Perfect.
Comment and then a question. My comment is, I'm encouraged, maybe optimistic by your faith in the power of your industry to change things. My experience has been from a New Zealand Aotearoa point of view that the real change comes when government actually advocates and forces an understanding of ethnic representation, of diverse representation through industry and through the commercial channels that we serve as creatives. And I wonder, have you seen any signs of that? Do you think there's any potential of that? And what hopes do you have what is your hope for the next phase of this? Because it seems to me that the industry, the practitioners, we only have a certain level of power when it comes to swaying the industry that we serve. So I'd be interested to hear your feelings on that.
So great question. Thank you very much. Remember I talked earlier about using my privilege? So I was lucky enough to be president of the Círculo Creativo, and when I was working in Mexico, I was vice president of various agencies. So there are still people in Mexico that I can converse with, and this research I've just finished, and it's my PhD research. So I'm waiting for it to be approved, and so I can have that stamp. Then I can take that and then get it out in the Mexican communities and speak to the actual people that are making decisions. And I was showing you there the different advertising bodies. So I would go to them, present kind of what I presented to you, so they would understand that headspace, and hopefully certain rules and regulations could be made. But also in Mexico, remember at the beginning I was talking about the La Raza Cósmica, which is the government philosophy, which means that Mexico is a super race because of the blending, which is a philosophy, which is a great philosophy. But what's happening now is that certain groups like the Afro-Mexicans are saying, but hey, we're here. Mexico for the first time recognized Afro-Mexicans only I think 3 or 4 years ago in the census, where people are self-identify. So Mexico is also going through that conversation about whether they use this raza cósmica, mestizaje, or whether they start recognizing distinct groups. So yeah, I don't know. That's my hope. And I will go to those government bodies and then try and get some rules discussed at least. Again, it's not what I want. It's just, here's the information I have. What do you think? That's sort of my plan on working. Yeah, thank you. Hi.
Hi, my name is Cassandra Alvarez and soy mexicana. So this is amazing to see, and this is a conversation that's happening everywhere with a lot of different communities. But for myself, I'm a communications director with Rulers on Engagement. We go by RAISE in Arizona. And what is your advice in guiding creatives who are not brown or black, that are white, and that are still very much living in that privilege, and guiding them into stepping into that creative way that, or I guess allowing brown and black and indigenous folks to guide them in the creative process. That's something that we face every day, especially with the lack of access for brown, black, and indigenous artists and creatives to the opportunities that maybe they don't have access to see, to learn, or skills that are not gaining because lack of access. So there's a lot of different challenges there. But I would love to learn from you and some of the ways that you would approach an issue like that.
Great, thank you very much. So one thing that I think is important is in Mexico that they integrate more people of color into the different levels in Mexico. So it's not just people who are light-skinned that are making the decisions, because Mexico is not just a racial society, it's also classist. So it's got those two things. So it's different than other countries. And that's what makes it complicated regarding Mexico. Your question about people, creatives who are white and their understanding of other cultures. One of the problems, and I think one of the methods that we use to solve problems is use stereotypes in our messaging. And I think one thing is to make creative people aware of when they're showing people of color, that they don't always go Mexicans, you know, with the sombrero, the bigote, and, you know, the family all together. And there's other ways of showing. So I would advise that not just going with the first thing that comes to your mind. And again, we need to be diverse in the agency. So it's not just one type of people that are making the decisions. Other people need to be involved and part of that process. Yeah, does that help? And the other thing I want to say though, as an advertising creative, we have to imagine what it's like to be the target market. So I have to do ads for people who are like 18-year-olds, and I'm not 18, but I have to research that. So I think people need to be, those creatives need to do better research. And again, look at their sources when they're getting their research as well. Yeah, you're welcome.
Hi, how are you? My name's Maffer. I'm from Peru, actually, so I'm very familiar with the type of advertising that we're talking right now. So I feel like my main question is kind of like secondhand in what you just said. As a creative or strategist, or just like handling an account for a specific company, how would you deal with a brand's potential pushback on the integration of diversity in on their own advertising? And by this, I mean like if they are, I don't know if to call this an excuse necessarily, but what if you're like dealing with a brand whose target audience is just like a little bit more, you know, like, because when you mention that like racism and classism are very like within one another, especially in like countries like that, the representation of certain like products, let's say that it's a little bit more expensive. How do you deal with, if you're dealing with a brand that has this type of product, and while you're also trying to integrate this diversity into advertising, however, you might get pushback from that brand and being like, well, that is not our target audience. If that makes sense.
Yes, no, totally makes sense. I guess the idea that I was talking about earlier about having best practices, because there are brands that are taking those risks and they have good sales and they're able to resonate with different target markets. So I would look for best practices, and we as an industry need to look for those and encourage that. That would be one. And then what was your other question regarding?
Oh, just like, let's say that you're handling like an account from like, for like a product that markets to certain like sectors that can only afford a specific type of price. I'm guessing I'm like on the higher end.
Yeah.
So how would you deal with like the fact that you need to create a campaign that also makes the client happy, but at the same time being not kind of like perpetuating this type of like stereotypes in countries like, you know, like in Latin America?
It's very hard because in advertising, what we do is go out to the consumer and then feed back. We're like a mirror and find out what they say, and we reflect it back to them through the ads. And that's why I created that one poster that said, if advertising reflects society that advertising is racist, because that's an argument that we use, and that's what came up when I was analyzing those online conversations. It is very hard, but if certain brands are doing it, then we can look towards those brands to be leading, and that would be that's the best answer I can give right now. It's very hard, but all these conversations that we're having, I think, help. And that poster campaign in Mexico generated conversations with people in advertising, and people were like, well, we don't have to do what we've been doing for all these years. Let's try something different. And that's the best I can say. Okay, thanks. Hello.
Hi, Cal. Well done. Just thinking about your point about change post finishing your PhD. Client and agency power. I think, my view, my experience is at the end of the day, if an agency wants to do something and a client doesn't, it won't happen. If a client wants to do something and an agency doesn't, it will still happen. So I'll give you an example. In the UK, Diageo now specify that any bid by a production company, there has to be a certain amount of bids, and there have to be diverse people.
Right.
But on both sides of the camera. So not just in front of the camera, but behind the camera. And that's part of their vision for 2040, etc. So just, interesting. Not the shortest question. I'll truncate it. What are your thoughts on making the change happen through clients rather than agencies, because they hold the power?
You're totally right. And in those conversations that I analyzed, specifically on LinkedIn, agencies always said, oh, it's the client's fault because they are the ones that pay and they make the decisions, yes or no. I love this idea, what you just talked about, Diageo, where they actually have it ingrained in their asks for pitches. When I worked in Canada as a creative director, the Canadian government had rules that said when you do advertising and you have one person, that person can be white, male or female. But when you have two people, has to be another gender, has to be another ethnic group. And so it was a rule that the Canadian government had created when spending Canadian tax dollars. So I totally understand what you're saying, and that's a great idea, the fact that maybe brands, because at the end of the day, they do have the final say. It's their money, not agencies' money. We're just a service for them, and they make the final decision. So yeah, it'd be great if brands can do that. And I try to, with the campaign, target brands as well as agencies, but most of my contacts are in advertising agencies, and that's sort of where I was able to get most of the conversation from.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Hi.
Thank you very much for the pretty fascinating topic. So just background of my question for the 30 seconds, I'm from the advertising agency in America. I'm an immigrant here, and now I'm teaching art direction at the advertising and communication program. Sometimes it's really, really hard to see whether as an advertiser, as a creator, are we serving kind of, the goal of the branding or kind of, cultural common sense of the audience. So what I'm trying to say, somehow this is white supremacy, let me say that in kind of advertising, not only it's been created by the creators or the advertisers, but also it's a kind of perception for the third country people. I'm from Asian country too, right? So that any kind of branding, advertising, having kind of white Caucasian, thing all of a sudden that looks cool, and that's what is going for. So when we serve a kind of a brand or the company client, advertisers has to kind of serve kind of the perception of the audience that it actually makes things a little cooler, or not by kind of just any kind of a discriminatory just intention. So oftentimes I think that is that the advertisers kind of just responsibility, or is it something to be a little larger issue that we need to kind of solve through the education and kind of a cultural kind of just a recognition of that's not the right perception that we are actually creating. So again, just my question is like, do we need to, if we need to fight, do we need to fight within kind of, advertising society, or do we need to kind of speak up for, or, just kind of aligned with next generation education and kind of, the cultural kind of, just evolution here to kind of eliminate this wrong perception?
Right. Very interesting question. So, like I said earlier, that advertising, we take things from popular culture and then we mix them up and create our messages. So it's not just advertising, it is the culture industries. We all work together and feed off each other and take elements from each other to produce whatever product it is, whether it's advertising or music. So it's very hard to change cultures. Advertising is just a small part, and that's just what I focus on, but I think it's a wider problem from the culture industries. And it's global. And another thing is that, there's actual colonization, which is physically going to another country and dominating it. But right now we have communication and colonization of the pupils and of social media and of all those other things. And so we also need to recognize that you can colonize people through their mind, through what their content they're looking at. So I think just having conversations like this to making people aware, also in education, in universities and colleges, we need to be telling young people this so that when they get into the positions of power, they're aware and they won't be making those types of decisions. Because I find that in Westminster, we teach the students how to create campaigns, but we also teach them the consequences of gender and of race through advertising and PR messaging. And so what they do is they produce more ethical, is what I call advertising. Yeah? Great. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for your work. I'm based in the US. I am Latina, and I'm sure you've heard of all the DEI rollbacks and all the things that we're not allowed to say anymore. And I've worked for some really big global companies that are a part of that rollback. And I'm wondering, unfortunately, I get the ethical call to action, but it seems like people, the powers that be, they don't care.
Mm-hmm.
So I think everybody in this room cares, and that's why they're here. Do you feel like we need to start reframing the conversation of, yes, and not only could we do better ethically, but also you're leaving money on the table by not doing this? Do you think that might be the next phase of the conversation of the economic impact of continuing to stereotype and recolonize us in a way?
So great question. I don't think, even though certain people are eliminating this way of thinking from their brands and their corporation, it's here and we're all aware of it. So we're educated. So I don't think you can stop it. I think it's going to continue. If a brand decides not to embrace diversity, well, that's their decision. And we as consumers also have the choice of where we spend our money. And I've seen lots of efforts recently with, I saw one against Coca-Cola because of something that happened where they voluntarily said to ICE about their workers and they came in. And so a lot of Latin Americans were boycotting Coca-Cola. So we have social media to get messages out. So it's if brands decide not to do it, well, then that's their decision. And if other brands embrace it, which there are quite a few, that's a good thing. And then we'll see what happens in the future with where people put their money. That's sort of the best way I think I can answer your question. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So we've reached the end of our time. So thank you very much. And if you can please rate this session, and you can do that on the South by Southwest app. That's a QR code to just some of my writings and stuff that I've done if you're interested. But if you can go to that page there and then just sort of let South by Southwest know that you enjoyed this session and you'd like more like this, that would be great. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.